Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, is there a lamp burning beside you tonight? Perhaps rain at the window, or simply the weight of silence settling in? These are the hours Watson trusted most, when observation revealed what daylight missed. Do subscribe to join us regularly. Now, settle in. For as Holmes knew, truth waits patiently for the careful observer. Find us on Spotify. The link is just below. Chapter 1. The Quiet Ledger. It was during the autumn of 1893, in that period of renewed companionship following my friend's remarkable return from what I had believed to be his final encounter at the Reichenbach Falls, that I found myself once more witness to the peculiar faculty of observation and deduction which had so often distinguished Mr. or a Sherlock Holmes among the consulting detectives of London. The weather had turned unseasonably warm, and the city lay beneath a haze that softened the outlines of its buildings and muted the ordinary clamour of its streets. I had returned to our old rooms in Baker Street, my practice being somewhat diminished by my recent absence, and found Holmes in a state of restless dissatisfaction that I had come to recognise as the precursor to either profound melancholy or sudden occupation. He had been pacing before the window when the card was brought up, and I observed the immediate transformation in his manner. The listlessness vanished, replaced by that alert intensity which signalled his professional interest had been awakened. "A Mr. Geoffrey Thornhill," he announced, examining the pasteboard with evident satisfaction. "Partner in the firm of Thornhill and Graves, solicitors of Lincoln's Inn. The card is fresh from the printer, Watson. You observe the sharpness of the lettering, yet the edges show the wear of a man who has carried it in his waistcoat pocket for some weeks. He is recently elevated to partnership, I think, and not entirely comfortable with the elevation." Before I could inquire how he had arrived at this conclusion, our visitor was shown into the room. Mr. Geoffrey Thornhill proved to be a man in early middle age, of medium height, and unremarkable appearance save for the quality of intelligent anxiety that marked his features. His dress was sober and precise, his manner that of one accustomed to the careful weighing of words. He acknowledged our greetings with a slight bow and accepted the chair which Holmes indicated. "Mr. Holmes," he began, after a moment's hesitation, "I come to you upon a matter which may prove to be entirely without substance. Indeed, I am not certain that there exists any matter requiring investigation at all, yet certain circumstances have troubled me sufficiently that I felt I must seek your opinion." "You're troubled by the death of Mr. Alistair Pembroke," said Holmes quietly. Our visitor started visibly in his chair. "How could you possibly know that?" "It is a simple enough deduction," Holmes replied, with that note of satisfaction he could never quite conceal when his reasoning proved accurate. "You're a solicitor newly made partner, as evidenced by your card. You come to me not upon a client's business, for then you would have mentioned the firm's interest at once, but upon some personal concern. Yet it is a concern touched by professional anxiety, or you would not have consulted a detective at all. The recent death of a legal clerk in chambers near your own would naturally fall within your knowledge, and if that death presented any irregularity sufficient to trouble a careful legal mind, it would provide exactly the combination of professional and personal unease which I observe in your manner." "You are quite correct," Thornhill admitted, with something like relief in his voice. "Alistair Pembroke died 4 days ago. He was the senior records clerk at Chambers in Furnival Street, a man of exemplary reputation and meticulous habit. The coroner ruled his death accidental, the result of a fall upon a narrow staircase within the records archive. There is no evidence of foul play, no suggestion of any motive for harm, and yet I find myself unable to accept the explanation with complete satisfaction." "Why?" Holmes asked simply. Thornhill leaned forward slightly. "Because Pembroke was the most cautious man I have ever encountered in matters of physical safety. He had maintained those records for more than 20 years without incident. He knew every board that creaked, every step that was uneven. The idea that he would descend that particular staircase in near darkness, as the evidence suggests he must have done, is entirely inconsistent with everything I knew of his character. You were acquainted with him personally, only through professional proximity. Our chambers share certain facilities, and I had occasion to consult the archives perhaps twice each year. Pembroke was invariably present, invariably precise, and invariably concerned with the proper preservation and security of the documents in his care. He was not a man given to carelessness. Holmes had moved to his chair and sat with his fingers pressed together in that attitude of concentrated attention, which I knew so well. "What else troubles you, Mr. Thornhill? For I perceive there is something beyond the mere inconsistency of character and circumstance." Our visitor nodded slowly. In the days before his death, Pembroke had been engaged in reviewing certain older records. This was not unusual in itself, as the archives occasionally require verification and reorganization. Yet he had requested access to files from cases 20 years past, files which would ordinarily have no present relevance. Moreover, I've observed a certain discomfort among those who were present in chambers when his body was discovered. Nothing overt, you understand, merely a quality of constraint in their manner when his name is mentioned. Who were these individuals? There was Sir Edmund Crothers, a magistrate now retired, who maintains a small consultancy room within the building. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, the widowed sister of the late senior partner, who serves as archivist and keeper of the older records. Mr. James Wickham, a shipping agent who rents offices on the ground floor, and Mr. Daniel Graves, my own senior partner, a barrister of considerable standing, though of somewhat reserved temperament. None of them knew Pembroke well, by their own admission, yet each seemed oddly affected by his death. Affected in what manner? It is difficult to articulate precisely. A hesitation in speech, perhaps, a tendency to change the subject when his recent work is mentioned, an atmosphere, Mr. Holmes, of shared unease without apparent cause. Holmes rose and walked to the window, gazing out into the hazy afternoon. "You have acted wisely in bringing this matter to my attention, Mr. Thornhill. I confess that the combination of circumstances you describe presents features of considerable interest. A man of meticulous habit dies in a manner inconsistent with that habit. He has recently been engaged in examining old records. Those who discover his death display a curious constraint of manner. Yes, I think we may find matter here worthy of investigation." He turned back to our visitor. "I shall require access to the chambers and to the records which Pembroke was examining. Can this be arranged?" "I believe so. Sir Edmund maintains nominal authority over the shared facilities, and I think he would not object to your presence if the matter were presented with appropriate discretion." "Excellent. Watson, I trust you are free to accompany me tomorrow morning. I fancy we shall find this case repays careful attention." I assured him of my availability, and after obtaining the necessary particulars of location and contact, we saw Mr. Thornhill to the door. When he had departed, Holmes returned to his chair with that expression of eager anticipation which I had learned to associate with a problem that had genuinely engaged his interest. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I inquired. "I make of it, my dear Watson, that the death of a records clerk may prove rather less simple than the coroner's verdict would suggest. When a man who has spent 20 years in safe navigation of a familiar staircase suddenly falls to his death upon that very staircase, and when that death coincides with his examination of old records which provoke unease in those who should have no connection to them, we are entitled to suspect that accident may be merely the appearance which conceals a darker reality. Tomorrow we shall examine the scene and those who inhabit it. I rather think we may find that the past, so carefully preserved in those ordered files, has reached forward to touch the present in ways that someone found most inconvenient." With that pronouncement he reached for his pipe, and I knew that his mind was already at work upon the problem, sifting through the meagre facts we possessed in search of that pattern which would illuminate the truth. Chapter 2. Shadows in Order. The morning arrived with that peculiar clarity which sometimes follows upon London's autumn haze, and I found Holmes already dressed and awaiting me at the breakfast table. He had consumed little beyond his customary coffee, and I recognised in his manner that singular focus which precluded ordinary appetite when a problem had taken hold of his imagination. We travelled by hansom to Furnival Street, arriving shortly before 10 o'clock at a building whose Georgian facade spoke of an earlier and perhaps more gracious era of legal practice. The entrance hall retained something of that former dignity, though the worn quality of the floor tiles and the dimness of the light suggested that present circumstances were rather more modest than past glories. A brass plate beside the inner door announced the presence of several firms and offices, arranged in the vertical hierarchy that seemed to govern such establishments. Mr. Thornhill met us in the vestibule and conducted us upward to the second floor, where the chambers occupied a suite of rooms overlooking the street. Sir Edmund Crothers awaited us there, a man of perhaps 70 years whose bearing retained the erect posture and measured authority of his former position. His face was lean and weathered, his eyes sharp beneath heavy brows, and his handshake possessed a firmness that belied his age. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he acknowledged, with a slight inclination of his head. "Thornhill has explained your interest in poor Pembroke's accident. I confess I see little purpose in disturbing what has already been settled by the proper authorities, but I am not averse to your making such examination as you deem necessary. The man served these chambers faithfully, and if there exists any detail which has been overlooked, it is only proper that it should be brought to light." "You are most accommodating, Sir Edmund," Holmes replied. "I shall endeavour to conduct my inquiries with minimal disruption to the normal business of the establishment." The rooms into which we were admitted presented a curious study in contrasts. The furnishings were old but well maintained, the carpets faded but scrupulously clean, and every surface displayed that quality of excessive order which sometimes indicates not merely tidiness, but a positive anxiety regarding disorder. Files were aligned with geometrical precision upon their shelves, ink bottles stood in exact rows upon the writing tables, and even the chairs seemed positioned with deliberate care. Holmes moved slowly through the main chamber, his eyes taking in every detail with that comprehensive glance which I had learned concealed the most minute observation. He paused before a writing desk which stood beneath one of the windows, its surface bare save for a blotter, an inkstand, and a small brass lamp. "This was Pembroke's desk?" he inquired. "It was," Sir Edmund confirmed. "We have left it undisturbed since the incident, though Mrs. Ashford has naturally had to remove certain active files for continued reference." "Mrs. Ashford is the archivist you mentioned." Holmes addressed this question to Thornhill, who had remained standing near the door. "She is. Her late brother founded this establishment nearly 40 years ago, and she has maintained the records since his death some 12 years past. She possesses an extraordinary knowledge of every document in the collection. I should very much like to speak with her. But first, if I may examine this desk more closely." Sir Edmund gestured his assent, and Holmes bent to his task with that methodical attention which characterised his approach to physical evidence. He examined the blotter under his lens, studied the inkstand and its contents, and ran his fingers along the underside of the desk's surface. Then he straightened and turned his attention to the surrounding area. "The air here is peculiar," he remarked. "Do you not notice it, Watson? There is a faint chemical odour, barely perceptible, but quite distinct from the ordinary smell of paper and ink." I had not observed it, but once Holmes had drawn my attention to the matter, I could indeed detect a subtle sharpness in the atmosphere, reminiscent of the solvents used in certain cleaning processes. "The floors were washed 3 days ago," Sir Edmund offered. "Perhaps that accounts for what you notice." "Perhaps," Holmes agreed, though his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied with this explanation. He moved to examine the shelves, running his hand along their edges and peering closely at the spines of the volumes they contained. "Everything here is remarkably well ordered. I observe that the files are arranged both chronologically and by category, with each position marked and labelled. Such a system would make the removal or replacement of any document immediately apparent." "That was Pembroke's particular genius," said a quiet voice from the doorway, and I turned to see a woman of middle years dressed in black, regarding us with an expression of watchful reserve. He could locate any record within minutes, and he would know at once if anything had been disturbed or removed. "Mrs. Ashford, I presume?" Holmes said, advancing with extended hand. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson. We are examining the circumstances of Mr. Pembroke's unfortunate death." She accepted his greeting with a slight inclination of her head, but did not return his handshake. Her features were regular but careworn, her hands long-fingered and ink-stained, her entire aspect that of one who had long ago resigned herself to a life of exacting and unrewarded labour. "I cannot think what there is to examine," she replied, her voice maintaining its quiet register. "The poor man fell. It was a tragic accident, but such things occur." "Yet you were fond of him, I think," Holmes observed gently. A flicker of something crossed her face, too brief to identify with certainty. "I respected his dedication to his work. We shared that much, at least." He'd been examining older records in the days before his death, Holmes continued. "Records from some 20 years past. Can you tell me what might have prompted this review?" Mrs. Ashford's hands, which had been clasped before her, tightened almost imperceptibly. The archives require periodic verification. It was routine work, nothing more. And yet he had selected specific files rather than conducting a general survey. Do you recall which cases had drawn his attention? "I do not maintain a record of every file that passes through these rooms, Mr. Holmes. Pembroke worked independently, as was his custom." Holmes smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "Of course. Forgive my imposition. Might I now see the location where the accident occurred?" Mrs. Ashford hesitated, then nodded. "If you wish. Though I must warn you, the staircase is narrow and poorly lit. You would do well to exercise caution." She led us through a side door into a passage that ran along the rear of the building. At its end, a doorway opened upon darkness, and I could discern the beginning of a steep descent into what appeared to be a basement archive. Holmes produced his pocket lantern and directed its beam downward, revealing a cramped stairway of perhaps 15 steps, its walls lined with shelving that held bundled documents and leather-bound volumes. "He fell here?" Holmes inquired, indicating the upper portion of the stairs. "He was found at the bottom," Mrs. Ashford replied, her voice now barely above a whisper. "The door had been left open. We discovered him when we came to work that morning." Holmes descended carefully, examining each step as he went. At the railing he paused and brought his lens to bear upon the polished wood. I saw his expression sharpen with interest. "There are marks here," he announced, "faint but distinct. The surface has been wiped, and recently. Watson, if you would bring your light closer." I complied, and in the combined illumination we could see what Holmes had detected. Slight streaks along the railing surface, as though something had been hastily cleaned away. Holmes touched the wood with his fingertip, then examined it closely. "Ink," he said quietly. "Or rather, the ghost of ink, incompletely removed. Someone has attempted to erase evidence of its presence." He continued his descent and began examining the floor of the archive chamber itself. The space was cramped and oppressive, filled with the musty smell of old paper and the peculiar silence that seems to accumulate in places long undisturbed. Upon a small table in the corner lay a ledger, its pages open to a section marked with a ribbon. Holmes approached it with evident interest, though he didn't immediately touch it. Instead, he circled the table, observing it from every angle, before finally bending to examine the open pages more closely. "This is the record Pembroke was consulting when he died?" he asked. "I believe so," Mrs. Ashford replied from the doorway above. She had not descended with us, I noticed, and her reluctance seemed to extend beyond mere concern for the stairway's safety. Holmes studied the page in silence for several moments, then straightened and looked back toward the stairs. "The light here is abysmal. Even with a lamp, one would require exceptional familiarity with these surroundings to work safely. Yet you say Pembroke was found in the morning, suggesting he had been here during the previous evening or night." "The door is kept locked after hours," Sir Edmund interjected, as having joined Mrs. Ashford at the top of the stairs. "Pembroke possessed a key, as did Mrs. Ashford and myself. No one else had access. I see. Holmes returned his attention to the ledger, producing his lens once more. There is something here which has been partially erased. A notation in the margin, written in pencil and then rubbed away. The impression remains in the paper, however. Watson, can you make out these letters? I leaned close and discerned, with some difficulty, what appeared to be a reference notation. A series of numbers and a single word that might have been a name, though the erasure had been thorough enough to render it largely illegible. Whatever this notation referred to, Holmes said, straightening once more, someone wished it removed from the record. The question before us, gentlemen, is whether that someone was Pembroke himself or another party altogether. He closed the ledger carefully and turned to face our small company. I believe I have seen enough for the present. I should like to speak with the other individuals who were present when the body was discovered. Mr. Wickham and Mr. Graves, I believe. The interviews were arranged, and we spent the remainder of the morning in careful conversation with both men. Each proved courteous but notably guarded in their responses, confirming the facts of the discovery while offering little in the way of personal observation or opinion. Their statements were consistent in their essential details, yet I detected in each that same quality of constraint which Thornhill had described, a careful choosing of words that suggested they were omitting rather than revealing. As we departed the chambers near midday, Holmes maintained a thoughtful silence until we had reached the street. Then he turned to me with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Well, Watson, what do you make of our morning's work?" "I confess I find the whole atmosphere of the place unsettling," I replied. "There is something artificial in that excessive order, as though the very tidiness were meant to conceal rather than reveal." "Precisely so. And did you observe the particular care with which each person avoided any direct reference to the specific records Pembroke had been examining? They will speak of his work in general terms, but press them upon the details and they become remarkably vague. That ledger in the archive holds the key to this matter. I am convinced of it. We must discover what case it concerned, and why its contents have proven so troublesome to those who inhabit these chambers. You believe the fall was not accidental? I believe, my dear fellow, that we are dealing with a matter far more complex than a simple accident. The wiped ink upon the railing, the erased notation in the ledger, the excessive tidiness of Pembroke's desk, and above all, the shared unease of those who should have no connection to his work, all these suggest a conspiracy of silence surrounding events which occurred long ago. Pembroke discovered something in those old records, something which someone found it necessary to conceal. Whether that necessity extended to murder remains to be determined. He hailed a cab, and we returned to Baker Street, where I knew he would spend the afternoon in that intense concentration which preceded his most brilliant deductions. Chapter 3. The Incident Reconsidered. Holmes spent the afternoon in Baker Street, immersed in that profound stillness which those unfamiliar with his methods might have mistaken for inactivity. He sat motionless in his armchair, his eyes closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, while the autumn light faded beyond our windows, and Mrs. Hudson came and went with tea that remained untouched upon the table. I knew better than to disturb him during these periods of intense mental concentration, and occupied myself with the day's newspapers and a monograph on gunshot wounds which I had been attempting to complete for some months. It was nearly 7 o'clock when he stirred at last. Rising with that sudden energy which marked the transition from contemplation to action, he crossed to his desk and withdrew a sheet of foolscap, upon which he began to sketch a diagram with swift, decisive strokes. "Watson," he said without looking up from his work, "I require your medical expertise. A man falls down a flight of 15 steps. The steps are narrow and steep, constructed of wood with a handrail on the right side descending. He is found at the bottom with injuries consistent with such a fall. What would you expect to observe?" I considered the question carefully. The nature and distribution of injuries would depend upon how he fell. If he tumbled headlong, I should expect trauma to the head and upper body, possibly fractures of the wrist or forearm where he attempted to break his fall. If he fell backward, injuries to the back of the skull, the spine, perhaps the shoulders and hips, And in either case, bruising along the limbs and torso where he struck the steps during his descent, possibly abrasions from contact with the wall or railing. Holmes nodded, adding details to his sketch. The coroner's report, which I obtained this afternoon through channels which need not concern us, describes injuries entirely consistent with a forward fall. Pembroke struck his head upon the stone floor at the base of the stairs, fracturing his skull. There were additional contusions upon his hands and forearms, and bruising along his right side. All of this accords with your analysis. Then the fall was indeed accidental? That is what the evidence suggests. And yet, Watson, consider the circumstances. Pembroke was a man of methodical habit who had navigated these same stairs countless times over 20 years. The stairway is poorly lit, as we observed, and would be nearly impassable in darkness. Why, then, would such a careful man descend without adequate illumination? Perhaps his lamp failed? A possibility I have considered, yet there was no lamp found near the body, failed or otherwise. Either he descended in complete darkness, which seems absurd, or he descended carrying a lamp which was subsequently removed, which suggests intervention by another party. I felt a chill at this observation. You believe someone else was present? I believe we must entertain that possibility. Let us reconstruct the sequence of events. Pembroke is working late in the archive, examining the ledger we observed this morning. Someone joins him there, either by arrangement or by chance. A confrontation ensues, perhaps regarding the contents of that ledger. In the struggle or flight that follows, Pembroke falls down the stairs. His companion, realizing what has occurred, removes the lamp and attempts to erase certain evidence of their presence before departing. The wiped ink upon the railing? Precisely. Someone with ink-stained hands grasped that railing, either in descent or in leaning down to examine Pembroke after his fall. The marks were hastily cleaned, but the effort was imperfect. The chemical odour we detected suggests that cleaning agents were employed elsewhere in the chambers as well, possibly to remove other traces of that evening's activities. He set down his pen and turned to face me. Tomorrow we must learn more about the precise nature of Pembroke's discovery. The ledger itself may prove difficult to examine in situ, given the watchful presence of Mrs. Ashford and the others. However, there are other sources of information which may serve our purpose. The coroner who conducted the inquest will have made detailed notes. The police, though they have closed the matter, will have compiled their own reports. And there exists, I believe, a possibility of discovering which specific case occupied Pembroke's attention in those final days. How do you propose to determine that? Through observation of what has been deliberately obscured. The erased notation in the ledger was partially legible, you will recall. I committed those fragments to memory and have spent the afternoon reconstructing the probable text. It appears to be a case reference number following the format employed by the courts in the 1870s. Tomorrow I shall visit the Central Criminal Court and examine their archives for any case bearing that number. The following morning found us at the Old Bailey, where Holmes's reputation and a few judicious words gained us access to the records office. The clerk who assisted us was an elderly gentleman of scholarly disposition, who required little encouragement to discourse upon the organisation of the court's archives and the various systems of notation employed over the decades. Holmes presented him with the reconstructed reference number, and after consulting several indices, the clerk disappeared into the stacks, returning some minutes later with a folder of yellowed documents. "The case of Regina versus Aldridge," he announced, laying the folder upon the table before us. "Tried in November of 1873. The defendant was convicted of fraud and complicity in the death of his business partner, one Mr. Thomas Hartley, sentenced to 15 years' imprisonment." Holmes opened the folder and began examining its contents with careful attention. I looked over his shoulder and saw that the file contained the usual collection of legal documents, indictments, witness statements, the judge's notes, and a summary of the verdict. Holmes studied each page in turn, occasionally making a note in his pocketbook, until he came to a section marked with a paperclip. "Here," he said quietly, "is something of interest. The witness statements." There were 3 principal witnesses: a clerk from the firm where the fraud was alleged to have occurred, a banking official who testified regarding financial irregularities, and a third individual whose testimony appears to have been decisive in securing the conviction. He indicated a page of closely written script, signed with a flourish at its base. This third witness, a Mr. Charles Fenimore, claimed to have overheard conversations between Aldridge and Hartley regarding the manipulation of accounts and the concealment of losses. His testimony placed Aldridge at the scene of Hartley's death and suggested premeditation. Without it, the case against Aldridge would have rested entirely upon circumstantial evidence of financial misconduct. And you believe this testimony was somehow connected to the ledger Pembroke was examining? I am certain of it. Observe the signature, Watson. It is executed with considerable confidence and matches the body of the statement in ink and hand. Yet there is something curious about the formation of certain letters. See here and here. The capital F and the C show a slight tremor, a hesitation that is absent from the remainder of the signature. It is as though the writer were unfamiliar with the name he was signing. I examined the document more closely, and indeed, now that Holmes had drawn my attention to it, I could perceive the irregularity he described. You suspect the signature is forged? I suspect that the entire identity may have been assumed. A genuine witness would sign his name without hesitation. This signature shows the careful deliberation of one who is reproducing an unfamiliar pattern. If I am correct, then the testimony which convicted Aldridge was delivered by someone other than the Charles Fenimore whose name appears in the record. But surely such a substitution would have been detected at the time. Not necessarily. Court proceedings are crowded and confused affairs. If the substitution were arranged with sufficient care, and if those responsible for verifying the witness's identity were either negligent or complicit, the deception might well have succeeded. Consider also that this was more than 20 years ago. Memories fade, records are mislaid, and in the ordinary course of events such a matter would never be revisited. He closed the folder thoughtfully. We must determine who the true witness was and what motive existed for concealing his identity. We must also discover whether Pembroke had reached the same conclusion and whether his discovery proved fatal. To answer these questions, we require access to the original witness record held in the chambers at Furnival Street. Can we not simply request to examine it? We could, but I think our interest would provoke precisely the alarm we wish to avoid. No, Watson, we must employ more subtle methods. Tonight, I believe, we shall pay another visit to those chambers at an hour when the ordinary occupants have departed, and when the archives may be examined without interruption. I confess this proposal filled me with some unease, yet I had long since learned that Holmes's methods, while occasionally irregular, were invariably directed toward the uncovering of truth. If a clandestine examination of records was required to prevent a miscarriage of justice, then I would not hesitate to assist him in the endeavour. We spent the remainder of the day in preparation. Holmes obtained certain tools which he deemed necessary for gaining entry to locked premises, a practice at which he had become remarkably proficient during his long career. As darkness fell over London, we made our way once more to Furnival Street, approaching the building from the rear where a narrow alley provided access to a side entrance. The chambers were dark and silent, their windows showing no gleam of light. Holmes examined the lock with his pocket lantern, selected an appropriate instrument from his collection, and within moments had gained us entry. We ascended the stairs in darkness, guided only by the faint beam of Holmes's light, until we reached the passage that led to the archive. Here Holmes paused, listening intently. Satisfied that we were alone, he proceeded to the door which gave access to the narrow staircase we had examined that morning. It stood unlocked, and we descended carefully into the archive chamber below. The ledger remained upon the table where we had seen it, and Holmes opened it at once, turning to the page that bore the erased notation. He produced a small vial from his pocket, along with a brush of finest camel hair. A solution of my own devising, he explained in a whisper, which renders visible impressions left in paper by the pressure of writing, even after the original marks have been removed. He applied the liquid with delicate precision, and before my eyes faint characters began to emerge from the blank margin of the page. They formed a reference notation identical to the one Holmes had reconstructed, followed by a name written in Pembroke's precise hand. The name was not Charles Fenimore. It was Eleanor Ashford. Holmes straightened, his expression grave. "So," he murmured, "we begin to see the pattern. Mrs. Ashford was the true witness in the Aldridge trial, testifying under an assumed name. Pembroke discovered this substitution and made note of it here. Shortly thereafter, he died at the foot of these very stairs. The question now becomes whether his death was truly an accident or whether his knowledge proved too dangerous to be permitted to survive." Before I could respond, we heard a sound from above, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard in the chambers beyond. Someone else had entered the building, and we were trapped in the archive below. Holmes extinguished his light instantly, and we stood in perfect darkness, listening as footsteps moved slowly across the floor above our heads, approaching the door to the archive stairs. Chapter 4. Words that Conceal. The footsteps above ceased their movement, and in the silence that followed I could hear the quickened pace of my own breathing. Holmes's hand found my arm in the darkness, his grip conveying a wordless instruction to remain absolutely still. And we stood thus for what seemed an eternity but could not have been more than half a minute, while whoever had entered the chambers remained motionless above us. Then, with startling suddenness, a voice called out, "Mr. Holmes, if you are below, I suggest you make yourself known. I am armed, and I have sent for the police." It was Sir Edmund Crothers, and the authority in his tone left little doubt that his warning was sincere. Holmes released my arm and produced his lantern, striking a light that illuminated our position. "We are here, Sir Edmund," he called up the stairs. "Dr. Watson and myself. You may lower your weapon, as we intend no harm and are engaged in legitimate investigation." There was a pause, then the sound of measured footsteps descending. Sir Edmund appeared at the top of the narrow staircase, where a revolver held with the practised ease of one who had long ago learned its use. His face was stern, but I detected in his expression more of weariness than anger. "Legitimate investigation conducted through breaking and entering, Mr. Holmes. I had thought better of your methods." "The door was unlocked," Holmes replied with perfect composure, "and our purpose is the prevention of injustice rather than its commission. I believe you know why we are here, Sir Edmund. You have known since we first visited these chambers that we would eventually discover the truth." The old magistrate descended the remaining steps slowly, his weapon now lowered but not holstered. When he reached the bottom, he moved to the table and observed the ledger with its revealed notation, his expression hardening. "You have been busy, I see. And what truth do you believe you have discovered, Mr. Holmes?" "That Mrs. Eleanor Ashford testified at the trial of Robert Aldridge under the assumed name of Charles Fenimore, that her testimony was instrumental in securing his conviction, that Alistair Pembroke discovered this substitution while reviewing these records, and that his discovery led directly to his death upon these stairs." Sir Edmund was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from the ledger to Holmes's face. Then, with a gesture of profound fatigue, he lowered himself into the chair beside the table and set his revolver upon its surface. "The police will not come," he said quietly. "I sent for no one. I've been expecting this confrontation since Pembroke died, and I am almost relieved that it has arrived at last. Yes, Mr. Holmes, you're correct in your essential facts, though the interpretation you place upon them may be premature." "Then perhaps you will provide the correct interpretation," Holmes suggested, his tone neutral. Sir Edmund drew a long breath. "Very well, but you must understand that what occurred happened more than 20 years ago, in circumstances very different from those which obtain today. The case against Aldridge was sound in its fundamentals. The man was guilty of fraud, of that there could be no doubt. But the evidence of his involvement in Hartley's death was largely circumstantial. Without a witness who could place him at the scene and testify to his state of mind, the charge of manslaughter would likely have failed. And so you arranged for Mrs. Ashford to provide that testimony under a false identity?" "I did not arrange it, Mr. Holmes." The suggestion came from another quarter entirely, but I permitted it, which amounts to the same culpability. Mrs. Ashford had indeed overheard conversations between Aldridge and Hartley. She worked in the offices adjacent to their firm and had occasion to be present during discussions which they believed were private. What she heard convinced her of Aldridge's guilt and of his intent to harm his partner. When the prosecutors sought additional evidence, it was suggested that her testimony could be decisive. "Why the false identity?" I interjected, unable to restrain my curiosity. Sir Edmund turned his weary gaze upon me. Because Mrs. Ashford's late husband had business connections to the firm in question. Had she testified under her own name, the defence would have attacked her credibility, as suggesting she held some grudge or financial interest in the outcome. By testifying as an anonymous clerk who happened to overhear these conversations, her evidence could be presented without such complications. And you, as magistrate, permitted this deception? Holmes's voice carried no judgment, merely a desire for clarity. I did. I believed then, as I believe now, that Aldridge was guilty and deserved punishment. The means employed were irregular, but the end seemed to justify them. I told myself that we were serving justice, even if we were bending its forms to do so. And Pembroke discovered this arrangement? He did. He possessed an extraordinary memory for details and an instinct for inconsistency. While reviewing the old records, he noticed discrepancies in the witness testimony, small contradictions in phrasing and detail that suggested the identity was fabricated. He confronted Mrs. Ashford, who confirmed his suspicions. Then he came to me. Holmes leaned forward slightly. When was this? 5 days before his death. He was deeply troubled, as you might imagine. Here was evidence of a fundamental violation of judicial procedure, and he was uncertain how to proceed. I attempted to explain the circumstances, much as I have explained them to you. I told him that Aldridge had served his sentence and been released years ago, that no practical purpose would be served by revisiting the matter now. But he was not satisfied with this answer. He was not. Pembroke was a man of absolute principle in matters of record and truth. He said he required time to consider the proper course of action, but that he could not simply ignore what he had discovered. I asked him to wait, to allow me to consult with the others who had been involved. He agreed to grant me 3 days. The others being Mrs. Ashford, Mr. Wickham, and Mr. Graves. Sir Edmund nodded slowly. Wickham had been the clerk who supposedly worked alongside the fictitious Fenimore. He provided corroborating testimony to establish the identity. Graves was a junior barrister at the time, and assisted in preparing Mrs. Ashford for her testimony. All of us share in the responsibility for what was done. And when those 3 days had passed, Pembroke died. He fell down these stairs on the evening of the 3rd day. Mrs. Ashford discovered him the following morning when she arrived to open the chambers. Holmes rose and walked to the base of the stairs, examining them once more in the lamplight. "Tell me, Sir Edmund, where precisely was the body found?" "At the bottom, just where you're standing. He lay upon his back, his head against the wall. There was blood, of course, from the wound to his skull." "And his lamp?" Sir Edmund hesitated. There was no lamp found with the body. Yet he would not have descended these stairs in darkness, would he? "I have asked myself that question 100 times, Mr. Holmes. The only answer I can conceive is that he carried no lamp because he was not alone. Someone else was here with him, someone who held the light and who removed it after the fall. You believe his death was not accidental. I believe it may not have been, but I have no evidence to support such a suspicion. Only the terrible coincidence of timing and the absence of that lamp." Holmes returned to the table and stood looking down at the ledger. After his death, someone attempted to conceal the evidence of his discovery. The notation here was erased, the railing was cleaned, and efforts were made to ensure that nothing in these chambers would suggest any irregularity. Who performed these actions? I do not know. I discovered the erasure in the ledger myself, several days after Pembroke's death. The cleaning of the railing I learned of only from your own observations. If someone among us attempted to hide what Pembroke had found, they did not confide in me. Yet you must have your suspicions. Sir Edmund met Holmes's gaze steadily. "I have suspicions regarding all of us, Mr. Holmes, myself included. Yet any one of us might have panicked at the thought of exposure. Any one of us might have felt that our reputation, our livelihood, our very liberty was threatened by what Pembroke had discovered. That is what makes this matter so painful. I have known these people for decades. I cannot believe that any of them would be capable of murder, and yet I cannot entirely dismiss the possibility. "What of Mr. Wickham?" I asked. "You mentioned he seemed volatile in temperament." "Wickham is impulsive and occasionally careless, but I've never known him to be violent. His involvement in the original deception was minimal, limited to confirming that he had worked alongside this Fenimore person. He had the least to lose from exposure. And Mr. Graves? Graves is a man of rigid self-control. He would view any threat to his professional reputation with the gravest concern, but he is not one to act rashly. If anything, he would seek a legal solution to the problem rather than a physical one. That leaves Mrs. Ashford," Holmes observed. Sir Edmund's face grew even more sombre. "Eleanor Ashford is a woman who has endured considerable hardship with dignity and grace. Her husband died in debt, leaving her with nothing. Her brother provided her with employment and shelter, and when he died in turn she continued his work with devoted care. The testimony she gave at the Aldridge trial was motivated by genuine conviction of the defendant's guilt. She has lived these 20 years with the knowledge of what she did, and I believe it has weighed heavily upon her conscience. Heavily enough to drive her to desperate action? I cannot say, Mr. Holmes. I simply cannot say." Holmes gathered up the ledger and turned toward the stairs. "Thank you for your candour, Sir Edmund. You have provided us with valuable context, though you must understand that the investigation cannot end here. If Pembroke's death was indeed murder, then justice demands that the truth be fully established, regardless of past considerations. I understand. I ask only that you remember the circumstances which led to the original deception. We were not villains, Mr. Holmes, merely flawed individuals who convinced ourselves that a small wrong could serve a greater right." "That is often how such matters begin," Holmes replied, not unkindly. "The difficulty lies in determining where they should end." We ascended the stairs in silence, Sir Edmund accompanying us to the street. As we parted, he paused and addressed Holmes once more. "Will you inform the police?" "That depends upon what further evidence we uncover. For the present, I am content to continue my inquiries privately. But I will discover the truth, Sir Edmund, of that you may be certain." The old magistrate nodded slowly. "I expected nothing less. Good night, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson." As we walked through the darkened streets toward the main thoroughfare where we might find a cab, I turned to Holmes with the question that had been troubling me since Sir Edmund's confession. "Do you believe him, Holmes, about not knowing who erased the notation?" "I believe he's telling the truth as he understands it, Watson. But the truth as one understands it and the truth as it exists may be very different things. Tomorrow we must speak with each of the others involved in this conspiracy of silence. One of them holds the key to Pembroke's death, and I mean to discover which one it is." Chapter 5. The Case from the Past. The next morning brought rain, a steady downpour that drummed against the windows of Baker Street, and cast the room in tones of grey. Holmes had been awake before dawn, I discovered, and had already dispatched several telegrams before I descended to breakfast. He greeted me with that abstracted courtesy which indicated his mind was fully engaged with the problem at hand. "I have arranged interviews with Wickham and Graves," he announced, pouring coffee with mechanical precision. "Wickham will receive us at 10 o'clock at his offices near the docks. Graves has agreed to meet us at 1 o'clock at his club in Pall Mall. I thought it best to speak with each separately, where they might feel less constrained by the presence of their fellow conspirators. You still regard them all as suspects in Pembroke's death?" "Until I have reason to eliminate them, yes. One among them knows more than they have revealed, Watson. Whether that knowledge extends to active participation in murder or merely to guilty observation remains to be determined." We finished our breakfast in contemplative silence, then set forth into the rain. The cab journey to the docks took us through streets grown unfamiliar with moisture, the usual London grime transformed into running rivulets that coursed along the gutters, Ramsay Wickham's offices occupied the ground floor of a substantial building overlooking the Thames, its windows offering a prospect of ships and warehouses shrouded in mist. The shipping agent himself proved to be a man in his middle 50s, powerfully built and ruddy of complexion, with the weathered features of one whose business frequently took him abroad. He received us in a cluttered office redolent of tobacco and damp wool, gesturing us toward chairs heaped with ledgers and manifests which he cleared with brisk efficiency. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, his voice carrying the rough edges of a self-made man who had risen from modest origins. "Sir Edmund sent word that you would be calling. I confess I am at a loss to understand what further information I can provide regarding poor Pembroke's accident." "Let us dispense with pretense, Mr. Wickham," Holmes replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "You're aware that we have discovered the truth regarding the Aldridge trial. What I require from you is an honest account of your role in that affair and your knowledge of recent events." Wickham's expression shifted, wariness replacing his initial affability. He drew a cigar from a box upon his desk but did not light it, instead turning it between his fingers with nervous energy. "My role was negligible, Mr. Holmes. I was a shipping clerk at the time, barely 20 years of age, and when certain parties required someone to confirm the existence of this Fenimore fellow, I agreed to provide such confirmation. I knew nothing of the substance of the case, only that my testimony would help secure justice." "You perjured yourself for the sake of justice." A flush crept up Wickham's neck. "You may phrase it as you like. I was young, eager to assist those in authority, and convinced that I was serving a righteous cause. If I had understood the full implications of what I was doing, I might have refused. But I did not refuse, and I have lived with that knowledge ever since." "Did Pembroke confront you about this matter before his death?" "He did not. I learned of his discovery only after he had died, when Sir Edmund gathered us together and explained what Pembroke had found. We were all shocked, naturally, and concerned about what might follow." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Where were you on the evening of Pembroke's death?" "At home with my wife, Mr. Holmes. We dined together and retired early. I had no reason to be at the chambers after hours and no knowledge that Pembroke would be working there that night." "Can your wife confirm this?" "She can, though I expect you will suggest that a wife's testimony on behalf of her husband is not entirely reliable. Nevertheless, it is the truth. You argued with Pembroke some weeks before his death, I believe. Something to do with financial discrepancies." Wickham's face darkened. "That was an entirely separate matter concerning a shipping invoice that Pembroke believed I had misfiled. He was mistaken, as I proved to him, but he was always pedantically insistent upon proper procedures. The argument lasted perhaps 5 minutes and ended with mutual apologies. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the Aldridge case." Holmes rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the rain-swept river. "Tell me, Mr. Wickham, what became of Robert Aldridge after his release from prison?" "I have no idea. I never followed the matter beyond the trial itself." "Did you never wonder whether the man you helped to convict was truly guilty?" Wickham was silent for a moment, the unlit cigar still rotating in his hands. "I told myself he must be guilty, Mr. Holmes. I told myself that men of Sir Edmund's standing would not have permitted such irregularities unless they were certain of the defendant's culpability. Whether I truly believed this or merely found it convenient to believe, I cannot now say with certainty." We departed shortly thereafter, Holmes maintaining his thoughtful silence as we made our way through the rain toward Pall Mall. The club where we were to meet graves was one of those establishments of quiet distinction which have long served as refuges for the legal and political classes. We were shown to a private room where Daniel Graves awaited us, seated beside a fire that did little to dispel the chill of the day. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, tall and spare, with silver hair and features of ascetic refinement. His manner was formal to the point of coldness, and when he spoke his words were chosen with the precision of one who had spent a lifetime in careful advocacy. "Mr. Holmes, if I understand you wish to discuss events which occurred more than 2 decades ago, and which have no bearing upon the present beyond their capacity to cause embarrassment to those involved, I am prepared to answer your questions, but I must ask what you hope to achieve through this inquiry. I hope to determine whether Alistair Pembroke died by accident or design, Holmes replied. Surely that is an objective you would support, Mr. Graves. If there were genuine evidence to suggest foul play, certainly, but I have seen none. Pembroke fell down a staircase in poor light. Such accidents are regrettably common, particularly among those of advancing years. Pembroke was 53 and in excellent health. Nevertheless, accidents occur. I fail to see how reopening the irregularities of the Aldridge trial serves any useful purpose in this regard. Holmes settled into his chair with deliberate ease. Then let me explain my reasoning. Pembroke discovered that the key witness in that trial was fraudulent. He confronted at least one of the parties involved. Within days he was dead under circumstances that appear accidental, but which contain certain elements that suggest otherwise. Someone attempted to erase evidence of his discovery. These facts, taken together, create a pattern which demands investigation. Graves absorbed this in silence, his expression unchanged. What is it you wish to know? I wish to know the precise nature of your involvement in preparing Mrs. Lee Ashford for her testimony under the assumed identity. I coached her in the manner of courtroom deportment and ensured that her testimony would be delivered clearly and convincingly. I also advised her regarding the likely questions she would face from the defence and the most effective manner of responding to them. You felt no qualms about suborning perjury. I felt, Mr. Holmes, that Robert Aldridge was a villain who had caused the death of an innocent man and deserved punishment for his crimes. Mrs. Ashford's testimony was essentially truthful in substance, even if the identity under which she delivered it was fabricated. I convinced myself that the ends justified the means. And do you still hold that conviction? Graves was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed upon the fire. I am no longer certain what I believe, Mr. Holmes. Time has a way of eroding the certainties of youth. What seemed clear and righteous at 30 appears considerably more ambiguous at 60. Where were you on the evening of Pembroke's death? Working late in my chambers at the Temple. I was preparing materials for a case and did not depart until nearly midnight. My clerk can confirm my presence there until that hour. Did Pembroke speak to you about his discovery? He did not. I learned of it only after his death, as did Wickham. Strange that he should confront Mrs. Ashford and Sir Edmund, but not yourself or Wickham, given that all four of you bore responsibility for the deception. Perhaps he intended to speak with us in due course. Perhaps he felt that the primary culpability lay with those who had conceived the scheme rather than those who had merely assisted in its execution. I cannot speak to his reasoning, as I had no conversation with him on the subject. Holmes questioned him further regarding details of the original trial, the relationships among the parties involved, and his knowledge of Pembroke's habits and character. Graves answered each inquiry with the same measured precision, offering neither more nor less than the question demanded. When we finally took our leave, I found myself no more enlightened regarding his potential guilt than I had been at the interview's commencement. As we descended the club steps into the continuing rain, I ventured to ask Holmes his assessment of what we'd learned. Both men are concealing something, Watson, though whether it is guilt or merely shame I cannot yet determine. Wickham's defensiveness suggests a consciousness of culpability, but his explanations are not inherently implausible. Graves maintains better control of his emotions, but his very composure may itself be suspicious. A truly innocent man might display more indignation at being questioned in such a manner. What of their alibis? Both dependent upon testimony that could be influenced by loyalty or affection. Wickham's wife and Graves's clerk would naturally wish to protect their respective charges. We require more definitive evidence before we can eliminate either man from consideration. Then we are no closer to identifying Pembroke's killer, if indeed there was a killer at all. Holmes hailed a passing cab before answering. On the contrary, Watson, I believe we're considerably closer. Each conversation has added detail to the pattern, and patterns, once sufficiently developed, reveal their underlying logic. What we require now is one final piece of information, and I believe I know where to find it. Where is that? in the records of Her Majesty's Prison Service. If Robert Aldridge is still living, I should very much like to speak with him. A man who spent 15 years imprisoned for crimes he may not have committed might have much to tell us about the value of false testimony and the lengths to which people will go to protect their secrets. He gave the driver an address in Whitehall, and we set forth through the rain-darkened streets, drawing ever closer to the truth that lay concealed beneath 20 years of carefully maintained deception. Chapter 6. A Shared Silence. The offices of the Prison Commission were housed in a building of grey stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect what little light penetrated the day's persistent gloom. We were received by a clerk whose manner suggested that inquiries regarding former prisoners were both unusual and faintly distasteful. But Holmes's credentials and a mention of Scotland Yard secured us access to the records we sought. Robert Aldridge, we learned, had been released from Pentonville in the spring of 1888, after serving 14 years of his sentence, 1 year having been remitted for good conduct. His current whereabouts were not recorded in the official files, but a notation indicated that he had reported to a parole officer in Clerkenwell for the required period following his release. The last recorded contact had been in 1890, some 3 years past, at which point his supervision had been formally concluded. A dead end, then, I observed as we departed into the rain, which had diminished to a persistent drizzle. Not entirely. The parole records will contain an address, however outdated it may now be. Such information is maintained at the local police station. A brief visit to Clerkenwell should provide us with our next step. The detective inspector at Clerkenwell proved more cooperative than I had anticipated, particularly when Holmes explained that our inquiries related to a possible miscarriage of justice. Within the hour we had obtained Aldridge's last known address, a lodging house in a narrow street not far from the Clerkenwell Road itself. The establishment was respectable if modest, maintained by an elderly widow who remembered Aldridge well despite the passage of years. He had been, she informed us, a quiet lodger who paid his rent promptly and gave no trouble. He had remained with her for nearly 2 years after his release before departing without specific explanation, leaving only a forwarding address in Brighton where correspondence might be sent. Did he seem a man capable of the crimes for which he was imprisoned? Holmes inquired. The widow considered this carefully. He seemed to me a broken man, sir. Quiet and sad, always polite but never warm, if you take my meaning. He spoke little of his past, though once he mentioned having been in business before his misfortune. I gathered he had lost everything, and everyone he valued. Did he receive visitors? None that I observed. He kept to himself entirely. Armed with the Brighton address, we returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately set about composing a telegram. I watched as he drafted and redrafted the message, seeking precisely the right combination of words to elicit a response from a man who had every reason to distrust those who claimed official interest in his affairs. It must be carefully phrased, Watson. Too formal, and he will suspect some new persecution. Too casual, and he will dismiss it as unworthy of reply. I am attempting to strike a balance between candour and discretion. The final version, when completed, read simply, "Information has come to light regarding irregularities in trial testimony, leading to your conviction. Stop would welcome opportunity to discuss matter confidentially. Stop Sherlock Holmes, Consulting Detective, Baker Street, London." We received a reply the following morning, terse but not unwelcoming. "Will call upon you Saturday afternoon. Stop Aldridge." The intervening days Holmes spent in restless activity, reviewing his notes, conducting chemical experiments whose purpose he did not explain, and disappearing for several hours on errands about which he remained characteristically cryptic. I occupied myself with my practice and with attempting to organise my own thoughts regarding the case, but found my conclusions invariably circular, leading back always to the same irresolvable question. Had Pembroke's death been accident or murder? Saturday arrived with clearing skies, the rain having finally exhausted itself, and by 2 o'clock we were awaiting our visitor with considerable anticipation. When Mrs. Hudson showed him into our sitting room, I found myself confronting a man whose appearance spoke eloquently of endured hardship. Robert Aldridge was perhaps 60 years of age, though the lines upon his face and the silver of his hair suggested he might be younger. He moved with the careful precision of one who has learned to occupy minimal space, and his eyes held that watchful quality common to those who have known confinement. Holmes greeted him with courtesy, and directed him to the most comfortable chair, offering refreshment which was politely declined. When we were settled, Aldridge spoke first, his voice quiet but firm. "Your telegram, Mr. Holmes, suggests that some error occurred at my trial. I confess this is not news to me, as I have maintained my innocence of the charges for which I was imprisoned these 23 years. But I am curious what has prompted your interest after so long a silence from the machinery of justice." "I have reason to believe that the witness testimony which secured your conviction was fraudulent," Holmes replied without preamble. "The individual who testified as Charles Fenimore was, in fact, someone else entirely, someone who assumed a false identity for purposes which remain unclear, but which certainly tainted the proceedings against you." Aldridge absorbed this information with remarkable composure, though I detected a tightening around his eyes that suggested deep emotion held in check. "I always suspected as much. The testimony attributed to this Fenimore person was too detailed, too perfectly aligned with the prosecution's theory, to be entirely credible. But I had no means of proving my suspicions, and my barrister advised me that such challenges would only antagonize the jury." "You were guilty of the fraud, however?" A bitter smile touched Aldridge's lips. "I was guilty of many things, Mr. Holmes. I was arrogant and careless in my business dealings. I trusted where I should have verified. I allowed pride to overcome prudence. But I did not murder Thomas Hartley, nor did I conspire to bring about his death. He died in an accident, a genuine accident, while we were in the midst of attempting to salvage our failing enterprise. His death destroyed what little remained of our firm and left me to face the consequences alone. Yet the testimony placed you at the scene with full knowledge of what would occur. The testimony was a fabrication from beginning to end. I was indeed present when Thomas died, but our conversation concerned methods of addressing our creditors, not plots to eliminate him. The witness claimed to have overheard discussions that simply never took place. I said as much at my trial, but who would believe the word of a man accused over that of an apparently disinterested witness? Holmes drew from his pocket the sketch he had made of the trial testimony. "Can you identify, from the substance of what this false witness claimed, who might have had knowledge of your private affairs sufficient to construct such testimony?" Aldridge studied the document carefully, his brow furrowing in concentration. "The details regarding our financial difficulties were not secret. Several people connected to our firm would have known of them, but the specifics of my relationship with Thomas, the pattern of our disagreements, these were more restricted in their distribution." "Who would have possessed such knowledge?" "Thomas's wife, certainly, our accountant, perhaps one or two of the clerks who handled confidential correspondence, and—" He paused, his expression growing troubled. "There was a woman who worked in offices adjacent to ours, the sister of the solicitor who held the lease on the building. She was often present when Thomas and I met. Zossen Kiendoy." And we grew careless about discussing business matters in her hearing. I never knew her name, but I recall her as being quietly observant, the sort of person one forgets is in the room until one has said more than one ought. "Would you recognize her if you saw her again?" "After so many years, I cannot say with certainty. But there was a particular quality to her appearance, a severity in her dress and manner, that might remain recognizable even with the passage of time." Holmes rose and retrieved from his desk a photograph which I had not previously observed. It showed a group of individuals posed before the entrance to the chambers in Furnival Street, evidently taken at some official occasion. He presented it to Aldridge without comment. Our visitor examined the image carefully, and then indicated a figure standing slightly apart from the others. "This woman here, I cannot swear to it, but she bears a strong resemblance to the person I remember. The set of her shoulders, the way she holds herself, these are familiar." The figure he indicated was Mrs. Eleanor Ashford. Holmes nodded as though this confirmation completed some pattern he had been constructing in his mind. "Thank you, Mr. Aldridge. You have been most helpful. One final question, if I may. Since your release from prison, have you had any contact with those who were involved in your trial?" "None whatsoever. I have endeavoured to leave that portion of my life entirely behind me. I now earn a modest living as a bookkeeper in Brighton, and have no desire to revisit the circumstances which destroyed my former existence. And if evidence were to emerge which might lead to the reopening of your case, would you welcome such a development?" Aldridge considered this at length before answering. "I am no longer the man who was convicted, Mr. Holmes. Prison changes one fundamentally, and the years since my release have changed me further still. If my name could be cleared, it would provide a certain satisfaction, but it would not restore what was taken from me. My wife died while I was imprisoned, unable to bear the shame of my conviction. My children grew to adulthood, believing their father a murderer. These things cannot be undone by belated exoneration. Nevertheless, the truth has value in itself." "Perhaps it does. If you can prove that I was wrongly convicted, I will not object, but neither do I harbour any great hope that such proof will materially alter my present circumstances." After he had departed, Holmes stood for some time in silent contemplation, his fingers drumming against the mantelpiece with that irregular rhythm which signalled intense mental activity. "Well, Watson, the pattern grows clearer. We have 4 individuals, all connected to the chambers in Furnival Street, all involved in the fabrication of witness testimony, which secured Aldridge's conviction. We have a records clerk who discovered this conspiracy, and who died under ambiguous circumstances shortly after confronting at least 2 of the conspirators. We have evidence of attempted concealment following that death. What does this suggest to you? That one among the 4 felt sufficiently threatened by Pembroke's discovery to silence him permanently. Precisely, but which one? And more importantly, how do we prove it? The evidence we have gathered is largely circumstantial. We can demonstrate that the testimony was false, and that Pembroke had discovered this fact, but we cannot definitively establish that his death was anything other than the accident the coroner declared it to be. What do you propose?" Holmes turned from the window with a gleam in his eye that I had learned to recognise as the precursor to some audacious stratagem. "I propose, my dear fellow, that we arrange for all 4 of our conspirators to gather in one place, where the truth may be drawn forth through careful application of pressure and observation. Tomorrow evening, and I think, a small gathering in these very rooms, where we shall reconstruct the events surrounding Pembroke's death, and see which among them reveals the guilty knowledge we seek. You intend to force a confession. I intend to create the conditions under which the truth becomes impossible to conceal. Human nature, Watson, is a remarkably predictable phenomenon. Place individuals under sufficient psychological strain, confront them with the evidence of their deceptions, and very often they will betray themselves through some small but revealing gesture. It is a technique I have employed before with considerable success." He moved to his desk and began composing invitations, his pen scratching rapidly across the paper. "Tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock, we shall have our answer." Chapter 7. The Plausible Culprit. The invitations were dispatched that very evening, each couched in terms that made acceptance a matter of professional necessity rather than personal choice. Holmes had phrased them with his characteristic precision, suggesting that new evidence had emerged which required the immediate attention of all parties connected to the Pembroke matter. By Sunday afternoon, we had received confirmations from each of the 4 individuals, though Mrs. Ashford's response had been notably delayed, and her acceptance qualified by evident reluctance. Holmes spent the intervening hours in preparation, arranging our sitting room with deliberate care. He positioned chairs in a semicircle facing his own, removed certain items from view, brace, and placed others in positions where they might be readily observed. Upon the table he laid out several documents, including the photograph that Aldridge had examined, and a copy of the trial testimony from the Aldridge case. When I inquired about his strategy, he merely smiled and advised me to observe carefully the reactions of our guests when certain revelations were made. "You have determined the guilty party, then?" I asked. "I have formed a hypothesis which the evidence supports, though I confess it is not yet proved beyond all doubt. Tonight's gathering should provide the final confirmation or refutation of my theory." At precisely 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hudson showed our first guest into the room. Mr. James Wickham arrived with the bluff assurance that characterised his manner, though I detected beneath it an undercurrent of nervous energy. He accepted the chair Holmes indicated and declined the offer of brandy, his eyes moving restlessly about the room as though cataloguing potential threats. Sir Edmund Crothers followed within moments, his bearing erect despite the evident weight of anxiety he carried. He greeted Holmes with a formal nod, and myself with a murmured acknowledgment before taking his seat. Mr. Daniel Graves arrived punctually, his expression neutral and his movements controlled. Only Mrs. Ashford came late, appearing at 1/4 the hour with an apologetic explanation regarding difficulties in securing transportation. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she settled into the remaining chair. When all were assembled, Holmes rose and stood before the fireplace, his figure commanding the attention of the room through sheer force of presence rather than any obvious gesture of authority. "Thank you all for attending this evening," he began, his voice measured and clear. "I have asked you here because the death of Alistair Pembroke, which was ruled accidental by the coroner, presents certain features which suggest a rather different conclusion. I believe that Pembroke was murdered, and I believe that the person responsible for his death is present in this room." The silence that followed this pronouncement was absolute. Wickham's ruddy complexion deepened to crimson. Sir Edmund's hands tightened upon the arms of his chair. Graves remained motionless, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Mrs. Ashford drew a sharp breath and pressed one hand against her chest as though to steady herself. "That is a grave accusation, Mr. Holmes," Sir Edmund said at last, his voice retaining its judicial authority despite the strain evident in his features. "I trust you have substantial evidence to support such a claim. I have evidence which I shall present in due course. But first, let us review what we know. 23 years ago, the four of you conspired to present false testimony at the trial of Robert Aldridge. Mrs. Ashford, you testified under the assumed name of Charles Fenimore, providing crucial evidence which secured Aldridge's conviction for manslaughter in addition to fraud. The rest of you assisted in various capacities to support this deception." Mrs. Ashford made as if to speak, but Holmes raised a hand to forestall her. "I do not propose to judge the morality of your original actions. You believed Aldridge guilty, and felt that the ends justified the means. What concerns us now is what followed from that decision. Alistair Pembroke, in the course of reviewing old records, discovered the substitution. He confronted at least 2 of you, and indicated his intention to report the matter to the appropriate authorities. This discovery threatened not merely your reputations, but potentially your liberty, for what you had done constituted serious criminal offences. We have already acknowledged this much," Graves interjected, his tone clipped. "What purpose does this rehearsal serve?" "It establishes motive, Mr. Graves. One among you possessed sufficient motive to prevent Pembroke from exposing your collective wrongdoing. One among you arranged to meet him in the archive on the evening of his death. One among you either caused his fall deliberately or failed to prevent it through negligence, then attempted to conceal the evidence of your presence." Wickham leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising with indignation. "And you presume to know which of us is guilty based on what evidence? We have all admitted our involvement in the original deception. That does not make us murderers." Holmes moved to the table and retrieved a small object which he held up to the light. It appeared to be a fragment of fabric, dark in colour and showing signs of having been torn from a larger piece. This was found caught upon a splinter on the archive staircase, some 3 steps from the bottom. It had been overlooked by the initial investigation, but was discovered when I examined the scene more carefully. The fabric is of a particular weave. A heavy wool commonly used in maritime clothing. He turned his gaze upon Wickham. "You are in the shipping trade, Mr. Wickham?" Your business takes you frequently to the docks and aboard vessels. You habitually wear garments suited to such environments. Is this fabric from your coat?" Wickham's expression shifted from indignation to alarm. "I have several coats of similar material. Half the men in London who work near the water own such garments. This proves nothing." Perhaps not in isolation, but consider also this. Holmes produced a second item, a fragment of paper upon which ink had been spilled. "This was found in your offices during a visit I paid there yesterday evening. It is a portion of a blotter, and the ink stain upon it matches precisely the composition of the ink used in the archive ledgers. Moreover, when subjected to chemical analysis, it proves to contain traces of the same solvent used to clean the railing where Pembroke fell." "You broke into my offices?" Wickham's voice was incredulous. "I obtained access through means which need not concern us. The relevant point is that this evidence places you at the scene of Pembroke's death and suggests that you attempted to erase evidence of your presence there." Sir Edmund had risen to his feet, his face grave. "Mr. Holmes, if what you say is true, then Wickham must account for himself. The evidence you present is certainly suggestive." Wickham stood as well, his hands clenched at his sides. "This is absurd. Yes, I may have been at the chambers that evening. I often worked late on my accounts in my ground floor office. If some fragment of my coat caught on the staircase, it could have happened at any time. As for the blotter, I have no explanation for it, but surely such evidence could have been planted by anyone with access to my offices." "Could you have been in the archive when Pembroke fell?" Holmes pressed. "I could have been, but I was not. If I had witnessed such an accident, I would have summoned help immediately. I am not a murderer, Mr. Holmes, whatever other faults you may ascribe to me." Holmes circled behind Wickham's chair, his movements deliberate. "And yet there is the matter of your argument with Pembroke some weeks before his death. You claimed it concerned a misfiled invoice, but witnesses suggest the confrontation was more heated than such a trivial matter would warrant. What was the true subject of your disagreement?" "I have told you already. It was nothing of consequence." "Was it nothing? Or was it perhaps that Pembroke had already begun to suspect irregularities in the old records and had made some inquiry which alarmed you? Did he perhaps mention the Aldridge case in passing, prompting you to realise that your involvement might soon be exposed?" Wickham's composure was crumbling visibly. Perspiration stood upon his brow, and his voice, when he spoke, had lost its former assurance. "He mentioned nothing of the sort. The argument was as I described it." Holmes turned to address the others. "Mr. Wickham has the strongest apparent motive among you for silencing Pembroke. His business depends upon his reputation for reliability and honesty. Exposure as a perjurer would destroy him financially and socially. Moreover, he possesses the volatile temperament that might lead to rash action under pressure. He was known to be in the building on the evening in question. The physical evidence places him at or near the scene. His explanations are weak and contradictory." He paused, allowing the weight of this accumulation to settle upon the room. "Based upon this evidence, I believe that James Wickham is responsible for the death of Alistair Pembroke." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Wickham stood trembling with what might have been rage or fear, while the others regarded him with expressions ranging from horror to grim satisfaction. I found myself convinced by Holmes's reasoning, for the evidence he had presented seemed to form a coherent and damning pattern. Yet even as I prepared to witness Wickham's collapse into confession, I observed something in Holmes's manner that gave me pause. His eyes, I noticed, were not fixed upon Wickham at all, but rather upon Mrs. Ashford, who sat motionless in her chair, her face drained of all colour, and her hands gripping the armrests with such force that her knuckles showed white. "Well, Mr. Wickham," Holmes prompted, "have you nothing to say in your defence?" Wickham drew himself up with visible effort. "I say that your evidence is circumstantial and your conclusions premature. I did not harm Pembroke, and I will not confess to a crime I did not commit, regardless of what fragments of cloth or paper you may produce. You may present your case to the police if you wish, but I trust that British justice requires more substantial proof than you have offered here tonight." Holmes nodded slowly, As though this response confirmed something he had anticipated. Very well, then perhaps we should consider the matter from another perspective entirely. He moved away from Wickham and approached Mrs. Ashford's chair, his voice softening to a tone of unexpected gentleness. Mrs. Ashford, you have been very quiet throughout this proceeding. Have you nothing to add to our discussion? She looked up at him with eyes that held a quality I could not immediately identify. What would you have me say, Mr. Holmes? You have made your case against Mr. Wickham. If the evidence supports his guilt, then justice must take its course. And yet I observe that you have been more distressed by my accusations than Wickham himself. Why should that be? Her lips trembled, but she made no reply. Holmes stood watching her for a long moment, and I saw in his expression that same penetrating intensity which marked the culmination of his most complex investigations. Because, he said quietly, you know that James Wickham is innocent, just as I know it. The evidence against him is too neat, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with what one might expect to find if one wished to divert suspicion from oneself. Is that not so, Mrs. Ashford? And with those words, the entire complexion of the evening shifted, and I understood at last what Holmes had been attempting to achieve through this elaborate performance. Chapter 8. Holmes's quiet refutation. The silence that followed Holmes's pronouncement was of a different quality from that which had preceded it. Where before there had been tension born of accusation, now there existed a stillness that spoke of revelation suspended and truth hovering at the threshold of utterance. Mrs. Ashford's face had become a mask of such rigid control that it was itself revealing, while Wickham appeared caught between relief and confusion, uncertain whether he had been exonerated or whether some new trap was being laid. Holmes returned to his position before the fireplace, his manner now contemplative rather than prosecutorial. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the dramatic weight with which he had accused Wickham, but rather the measured tones of one laying out a mathematical proof. Let me explain my reasoning, for I confess I have been less than forthright in my presentation this evening. The evidence against Mr. Wickham, while superficially compelling, contains several features which troubled me from the moment I discovered it. Chief among these is the matter of visibility. The fragment of cloth caught upon the staircase was positioned precisely where it would be noticed by anyone conducting even a cursory examination. The blotter bearing the telltale ink was left upon a desk in plain view rather than destroyed or concealed. These are not the actions of a guilty man attempting to hide his involvement, but rather the marks of someone wishing to direct suspicion toward a particular target. Wickham had sunk back into his chair, his expression now showing dawning comprehension. You mean the evidence was planted? I believe so, yes. Consider also the nature of the evidence itself. You're a shipping agent, Mr. Wickham, not a clerk who works with documents. The solvent used to clean the railing in the archive is of a type employed specifically for removing ink stains from paper and wood. Why would you possess such a substance? Your business deals with manifests and bills of lading, documents which are written but rarely corrected with such precision. A records keeper, however, or an archivist, would have ready access to such materials as a matter of daily necessity. I saw the logic of this observation, and wondered that I had not perceived it earlier. Holmes continued, his attention now distributed among all four of our guests rather than focused upon Wickham alone. Furthermore, there is the question of knowledge. To plant evidence implicating Wickham would require intimate familiarity with his habits, his schedule, and his physical presence in the building. Who among you would possess such knowledge? Not Sir Edmund, who maintains only occasional presence in the chambers, not Mr. Graves, whose practice keeps him largely at the Temple, but Mrs. Ashford, who manages the daily operations of the archive and observes the comings and goings of all who work in the building, would naturally be aware of when Wickham was present and when his offices stood empty. Mrs. Ashford's hands had not relaxed their grip upon the armrests, though her voice when she spoke remained level. This is speculation, Mr. Holmes. You have no proof that I planted anything. Do I not? Let us examine the sequence of events with greater care. Pembroke discovered the substitution of witness testimony. He confronted you directly as the person whose identity had been concealed. You attempted to persuade him that the matter was best left undisturbed, that reopening it would serve no useful purpose, but Pembroke was a man of rigid principle, and he informed you that he intended to report his findings. Holmes began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. You were faced with a terrible choice. Exposure would not only destroy your reputation, but might well result in criminal prosecution for perjury. At your age, with your limited means, such a fate would be catastrophic. You had lived for more than 20 years with the weight of what you had done, telling yourself that it had served justice even if it had violated the law. And now this meticulous clerk threatened to undo everything. "You cannot know what I thought or felt," Mrs. Ashford protested, as though the tremor in her voice belied the firmness of her words. "Can I not? I believe I can reconstruct your state of mind with reasonable accuracy. You arranged to meet Pembroke in the archive on the evening of his death. Perhaps you hoped to make one final appeal to his compassion. Perhaps you planned from the beginning what ultimately occurred. Only you can say with certainty. But when you confronted him there, upon those narrow stairs, something transpired which resulted in his fall." Sir Edmund leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Holmes, you are making grave accusations without direct evidence. Mrs. Ashford's distress this evening proves nothing beyond the natural anxiety of one caught up in painful circumstances." "True enough, but consider what I observed when we first visited the archive. The chemical odour, which I attributed at the time to floor cleaning, was strongest near the railing and the table where the ledger lay. Mrs. Ashford would have had both motive and means to clean those surfaces after Pembroke's death. The erasure of the notation in the ledger would have required someone with intimate knowledge of where such notations might be found and how they might be removed without destroying the document itself. Again, this points to someone with archival expertise rather than a shipping agent or barrister." Holmes paused before Mrs. Ashford's chair and regarded her with an expression that mingled pity with resolve. "But what convinced me beyond doubt was your reaction when I accused Wickham. A truly innocent person, wrongly suspected, would have protested with indignation. A guilty person seeking to maintain their deception would have seized upon the accusation against another with relief, perhaps even contributing additional condemnation to cement the false conclusion. You did neither. Instead, you sat in frozen silence, and I saw in your face not relief, but something very like despair." "Why despair?" I asked, unable to restrain the question. "Because she knew that I was testing her, Watson. Because she recognised that the evidence against Wickham was too perfect, too convenient, and that I was observing her reaction to gauge whether she had been responsible for creating it. And because, I suspect, she has been waiting for this moment since Pembroke died, living each day with the knowledge of what she had done and the certainty that it would eventually come to light." Mrs. Ashford closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held a quality of terrible weariness. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes, that I have been waiting, but you are wrong in some particulars of your reconstruction. I did not plan to harm Alistair Pembroke. I did not even plan the meeting in the archive. He was working late, as he often did, and I simply could not bear the weight of silence any longer. I went to speak with him, to explain, to make him understand." Her voice had dropped almost to a whisper, yet in the stillness of the room every word carried with perfect clarity. "He was kind, you must understand. He listened to my explanation of why I had testified as I did, of my genuine conviction that Aldridge was guilty, of the circumstances which had led me to accept the deception. But he said his duty was clear, that he could not suppress evidence of wrongdoing, regardless of the motives which had prompted it, or the time which had elapsed since its commission." "What happened then?" Holmes asked gently. "I became distraught. I pleaded with him to reconsider, to show mercy not just to me, but to Sir Edmund and the others who would be ruined alongside me. He was unmoved, though not unkind. He said that justice required truth, and that truth could not be subordinated to considerations of convenience or compassion. I turned to leave, but my vision was blurred by tears and I stumbled. He reached out to steady me, and in that moment, she paused, her breathing uneven. I cannot say precisely what occurred. I pushed against him, whether in anger or desperation or simple loss of balance, I truly do not know. He fell backward down the stairs, and I heard the terrible sounds of his descent and then silence. I stood frozen for what seemed an eternity before I could bring myself to descend and see what had happened. He was already dead, Holmes inquired. He was unconscious and bleeding. I called his name, but he did not respond. I should have summoned help immediately, I know this. But instead I panicked. I realized that if his death were investigated as suspicious, everything would come to light. So I took his lamp and fled. I returned hours later, after midnight, and found him still lying there, now certainly dead. It was then that I attempted to clean the railing where I had gripped it, and to erase the notation he had made in the ledger. Graves spoke for the first time in many minutes, his voice harsh with emotion. "You let him lie there for hours? If you had called for help, he might have been saved." "I know," Mrs. Ashford replied simply. "That knowledge has consumed me every moment since. The fall itself might have been an accident, but my failure to seek help made me as culpable as if I had pushed him deliberately. I am guilty, Mr. Graves, of his death and of the cowardice which followed it." "And the evidence against Wickham?" I asked, still struggling to comprehend the full scope of what she had done. A desperate attempt to protect myself. I knew that suspicion must eventually fall somewhere, and I thought if I could direct it towards someone else, someone whose guilt seemed plausible, I might escape detection. I took fabric from one of his coats when he left it hanging in the corridor. I created the blotter using materials I knew would connect him to the scene. It was contemptible, and I'm ashamed of it, but I was terrified of what would become of me if the truth emerged. Holmes moved to the window and stood gazing out into the darkness, his profile sharp against the lamplight. There remains the question of Robert Aldridge. Was he indeed guilty of the crimes for which he was imprisoned? Mrs. Ashford's voice was barely audible. I believed he was. I heard conversations which convinced me of his culpability. But I cannot now swear that my interpretation was correct. I was young, and perhaps I heard what I expected to hear rather than what was actually said. If I help to imprison an innocent man, that is yet another burden I must carry. Sir Edmund rose heavily from his chair. "What happens now, Mr. Holmes? Do you intend to inform the police?" Holmes turned from the window, his expression grave. "That decision is not mine alone to make. Mrs. Ashford has confessed to actions which certainly constitute serious crimes, yet I am not a magistrate, and I have no official standing in this matter. Dr. Watson and I have conducted a private investigation at the request of a client who was troubled by inconsistencies surrounding Pembroke's death. We have discovered the truth, but what should be done with that truth is a question which admits of no simple answer." He looked at each of them in turn. "You have all lived with the consequences of your choices for more than 20 years. Those consequences will continue regardless of what action is taken now. Pembroke is dead, and nothing can restore him to life. Aldridge has served his sentence and built a new existence from the ruins of the old. The question before us is whether formal justice serves any purpose at this juncture, or whether it merely compounds the suffering which has already been inflicted." The room was silent as each person grappled with the weight of this question. I found myself unable to formulate a clear response, torn between my instinct for justice and my recognition that the situation admitted of no resolution, which would truly satisfy either law or conscience. At length, it was Mrs. Ashford herself who spoke. "I will confess to the police, Mr. Holmes. I cannot continue to live with this deception. Whatever punishment awaits me, it cannot be worse than the torment I have endured these past days." Holmes nodded slowly. "That is your choice to make, Mrs. Ashford." "Oh, I will not stand in your way." And thus concluded what I had expected to be a dramatic confrontation, not with thunder, but with quiet resignation, leaving all of us to contemplate the terrible complexity of human motivation and the inadequacy of simple judgments in the face of genuine moral ambiguity. Chapter 9. The Truth of the Record. Mrs. Ashford's declaration hung in the air, and I expected Holmes to acknowledge it with approval or at least acceptance. Instead, he remained at the window, his posture suggesting continued contemplation rather than satisfaction at a case resolved. When he turned back to face the room, his expression held that peculiar intensity, which I had learned indicated some final piece of the puzzle remained to be placed. "Your willingness to confess is admirable, Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "and I have no doubt that you speak what you believe to be the truth. But I must ask you to consider whether your account is entirely accurate in all its particulars." She looked at him with evident confusion. "I have told you what happened, Mr. Holmes. I have concealed nothing. Have you not? Let us examine your narrative with the same scrutiny we applied to the evidence against Wickham. You say that you stumbled on the stairs and pushed against Pembroke, causing him to fall, yet the physical evidence suggests a rather different sequence of events." Holmes moved to the table and retrieved the sketch he had made of the staircase. "When Watson and I first examined the scene, I noted the position and pattern of the ink marks upon the railing. They were not consistent with someone gripping the rail for balance while descending. Rather, they suggested someone leaning down from above, reaching towards something or someone below. The angle was wrong for a stumble or a push delivered from the same level." "I don't understand," Mrs. Ashford whispered. "I believe you were not upon the stairs when Pembroke fell. I believe you were at the top, and that he was already descending when the incident occurred. The question is, what caused him to fall?" Sir Edmund interrupted, his voice sharp with renewed concern. "Holmes, what are you suggesting? If Mrs. Ashford was not responsible for the fall itself, then who was?" Holmes did not answer directly, but instead posed a question to Mrs. Ashford. "When you went to the archive that evening, was Pembroke alone?" She hesitated, her brow furrowing as though attempting to recall details she had previously overlooked. I believed he was, but the archive was dark, save for his lamp. I suppose someone else could have been present without my knowledge. And when you heard him fall, did you hear anything else? Voices, perhaps, or the sound of another person moving?" Mrs. Ashford closed her eyes, clearly struggling to reconstruct the memory. Yes, I think there was a voice. Very quiet, possibly calling his name, but I was so distressed that I cannot be certain. I assumed it was my own voice I heard, or perhaps merely an echo." Holmes nodded as though this confirmed his suspicion. "You assumed many things that evening, Mrs. Ashford, because your mind was overwhelmed by guilt and fear. You believed you had caused Pembroke's death, and so you interpreted every subsequent action through that lens of responsibility. But I think the truth is rather different." He turned his attention to Sir Edmund, who had grown very still in his chair. "You told us, Sir Edmund, that you arrived at the chambers the morning after Pembroke's death, and found Mrs. Ashford already present. You said that she had discovered the body when she came to open the archive. Is that correct?" "It is," Sir Edmund replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "And where were you on the evening of Pembroke's death?" "I was at home. I've already stated as much." "Can anyone confirm this?" "I live alone, Mr. Holmes, and have done since my wife's death 5 years ago. I have no alibi beyond my own word, but I have no need of one. I was not present when Pembroke died." Holmes walked slowly around Sir Edmund's chair, his manner reminiscent of a chess master considering his final moves. "You have been remarkably forthcoming about the irregularities of the Aldridge trial, Sir Edmund. You have acknowledged your role in permitting the false testimony, and have expressed appropriate remorse for that decision. Yet there is one element of your account which has troubled me from the beginning." "What element is that?" "Your statement that Pembroke came to you 3 days before his death, and that you asked him to wait while you consulted with the others involved. This places you in the position of mediator, of one attempting to find a solution which might satisfy both justice and mercy. It is a sympathetic portrayal, and I suspect it is largely accurate. But it omits certain crucial details regarding the nature of your final conversation with Pembroke." Sir Edmund's composure began to show faint cracks. "I have told you everything of significance. Have you? Let us consider what we know of your character and your circumstances. You are a magistrate of considerable reputation, known for your integrity and your commitment to the law. The exposure of your involvement in the false testimony would not merely tarnish that reputation, but destroy it entirely. Everything you had built over a lifetime of service would be revealed as founded upon a lie. For a man of your pride and your principles, such a prospect would be unendurable. Holmes paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. When Pembroke informed you that he intended to report his findings regardless of your plea for discretion, you realised that persuasion had failed. You made one final attempt to prevent the disclosure, did you not? This is speculation, Sir Edmund said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? I think if we examine the evidence more carefully, we shall find it is rather more than speculation. The lamp which was missing from the scene was never found in Mrs. Ashford's possession, nor in that of any other suspect. Yet someone removed it. Someone who arrived at the archive while Pembroke was still working. Someone who engaged him in conversation which drew him to the top of the stairs. Someone who then attempted a final appeal which Pembroke rejected. Holmes's voice grew quieter but no less forceful. In that moment of rejection, you made a choice. Perhaps you reached out to detain him, to prevent him from leaving with his resolution intact. Perhaps the gesture was more deliberate than that. But Pembroke lost his balance, or was pushed, and he fell. You descended to where he lay, took his lamp to prevent its being found with the body, and departed. Later, when Mrs. Ashford arrived and found him, you allowed her to believe herself responsible, knowing that her guilt would shield you from suspicion. The room had gone utterly silent. Mrs. Ashford stared at Sir Edmund with an expression of dawning horror. Wickham and Graves sat frozen, their attention riveted upon the old magistrate. Sir Edmund's face had become a mask of rigid control, but his hands trembled slightly where they rested upon his knees. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You have no proof of this, Holmes. It is merely a theory, constructed from the same fragmentary evidence that pointed toward Mrs. Ashford and Wickham. I have more than theory, I fear. When I examined the archive, I noted that certain documents had been disturbed recently. Among them was a logbook which recorded visits to the archive outside of normal working hours. You signed that logbook on the evening of Pembroke's death, Sir Edmund. You were there, in the building, at the time he fell. You claim to have been at home, but the evidence proves otherwise. Sir Edmund closed his eyes, and I saw in that gesture the collapse of the final barrier he had maintained against the truth. The logbook, he murmured. I had forgotten the logbook. You forgot because your mind was occupied with more pressing concerns, Holmes said. Not unkindly. The disposal of the lamp, the crafting of your alibi, the management of Mrs. Ashford's guilt to serve your purposes. It was an oversight any man might make under such circumstances. The old magistrate opened his eyes and looked around the room at the faces watching him. Some quality had gone out of his bearing, some essential stiffness that had sustained him throughout his life. He seemed suddenly to have aged a decade. I did not intend to harm him, he said, his voice carrying the weight of profound exhaustion. I swear to you, I did not intend it. I went to make one final appeal, to offer him any inducement that might secure his silence. Money, influence, anything within my power to grant. He refused it all. He said that truth could not be purchased, and that justice demanded honesty regardless of cost. Sir Edmund's hands clenched into fists upon his knees. I became angry. After a lifetime of service to the law, to be lectured on justice by a clerk seemed an unbearable insult. I said things I should not have said. He turned to leave, and I reached for him. Whether to detain him or to strike him I honestly cannot say. He pulled away, lost his footing, and fell. You took the lamp, Holmes prompted gently. I took the lamp. I told myself he might merely be unconscious. That help might still save him. But I could not risk being found there, could not allow the questions that would inevitably follow. So I left him in the darkness and fled like a coward. When Mrs. Ashford appeared the next morning, distraught and convinced of her own guilt, I said nothing to correct her misapprehension. I allowed her to suffer for my crime. He looked at Mrs. Ashford, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Can you forgive me, Eleanor? I have let you bear the weight of what I did, and I have no excuse for such monstrous selfishness. Mrs. Ashford's face was pale, but her voice when she spoke was steady. I cannot forgive you, Sir Edmund, because there is nothing to forgive. We are both guilty, each in our own way. I came to the archive that night with my own desperate intentions. If you had not been there, perhaps I would have done what you did. We cannot know what choices we might have made in circumstances slightly altered. Holmes had moved back to his chair and sat regarding them both with an expression of profound sadness. The law will determine what punishment is appropriate for these actions. I cannot make that judgment, nor would I presume to do so. But I can tell you that the truth has value in itself, regardless of the pain it causes in its revelation. Robert Aldridge deserves to know that his conviction was secured through false testimony. Alistair Pembroke deserves to have the circumstances of his death properly understood. These things cannot restore what has been lost, but they can prevent the continued propagation of lies. Sir Edmund nodded slowly. I will make a full confession to the police. It is the least I can do, and far less than justice demands. And I will confirm that confession with my own, Mrs. Ashford added. Whatever my role in that night's events, I allowed an innocent man to be suspected and failed to seek help when it might have saved a life. I bear my share of the guilt. As they spoke these words, I felt a curious mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The case was solved, the truth revealed, yet the resolution brought no sense of triumph. Instead, I was left contemplating the terrible complexity of human weakness and the cascading consequences that flow from single moments of poor judgment. Holmes seemed to share this melancholy, for when our guests had departed, Sir Edmund and Mrs. Ashford to prepare their confessions, Wickham and Graves to grapple with their own roles in the larger tragedy. He sat in silence for some time, his pipe forgotten in his hand. "A sad business, Watson," he said at last. "Indeed," I agreed. "And yet you uncovered the truth with remarkable clarity." "Truth is not always a blessing," he replied. Sometimes it is merely necessary." Chapter 10. The Weight of Memory. The days that followed our gathering in Baker Street unfolded with a sombre inevitability that seemed fitting to the nature of the case we had resolved. Sir Edmund Crothers presented himself at Scotland Yard on the Monday morning, and made a full confession to the circumstances surrounding Alistair Pembroke's death. Mrs. Eleanor Ashford accompanied him, and provided her own statement regarding both the false testimony of 23 years prior and her actions on the night of Pembroke's fall. The police, having initially closed the matter as accidental death, were compelled to reopen their investigation, though the essential facts were not in dispute. Holmes and I were called upon to provide testimony regarding our investigation, and I spent several uncomfortable hours in the offices of Inspector Lestrade, recounting the sequence of discoveries which had led to the truth. Lestrade, to his credit, acknowledged that the case had been more complex than the initial evidence suggested, though he could not resist observing that Holmes's methods, while effective, remained somewhat irregular. "You might have brought your suspicions to us earlier, Mr. Holmes," he remarked, not without justice. "We have the resources to conduct a proper investigation without resorting to nocturnal examinations of private premises." "And yet," Holmes replied mildly, "your proper investigation concluded with a verdict of accidental death. Sometimes the irregular approach yields results which the regular one overlooks." The matter proceeded through the judicial system with efficiency that spoke to the clarity of the evidence and the willingness of the principals to acknowledge their culpability. Sir Edmund was charged with manslaughter, a charge which recognised that while his actions had caused Pembroke's death, there had been no premeditated intent to kill. Mrs. Ashford faced charges related to the obstruction of justice and to her failure to render aid, though the prosecution acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of her distress and confusion on that terrible evening. The trial, when it came, attracted considerable attention in the legal community, both for the prominence of the accused and for the revelation of the false testimony in the Aldridge case. Yeah, I attended several sessions and found them profoundly melancholy affairs. Sir Edmund presented himself with dignity, making no attempt to minimise his actions or to shift blame to others. His barrister argued for leniency based on his age, his lifetime of service to the law, and the absence of any prior misconduct. But Sir Edmund himself seemed indifferent to these pleas, accepting whatever judgment might be rendered with the resignation of one who has already condemned himself more harshly than any court might do. Mrs. Ashford's testimony was particularly affecting. She spoke of her belief in Robert Aldridge's guilt, of her willingness to testify under false identity in service of what she understood as justice, and of the burden she had carried for more than 2 decades. When asked about the night of Pembroke's death, she acknowledged that her actions had been motivated by panic and self-preservation, rather than any reasoned assessment of the circumstances. She had believed herself guilty and had acted accordingly, compounding tragedy with deception. The verdict, when delivered, reflected both the gravity of the offences and the court's recognition of the complex circumstances which had given rise to them. Sir Edmund was sentenced to 3 years' imprisonment, a term which all acknowledged he was unlikely to survive given his advanced age and declining health. Mrs. Ashford received a sentence of 18 months, suspended on condition of her continued cooperation with authorities and her agreement to provide full testimony in any proceedings related to the Aldridge case. It was this latter matter which occupied much of Holmes's attention in the weeks following the trial. The revelation that Robert Aldridge's conviction had been secured through perjured testimony demanded a formal review of the case, and Holmes involved himself extensively in the process. He travelled to Brighton to consult with Aldridge himself, who proved surprisingly philosophical about the prospect of posthumous exoneration. "I have built a new life, Mr. Holmes," Aldridge told him, as Holmes later recounted to me. "The man who was convicted in 1873 no longer exists. Whether his name is cleared or remains tarnished is of less consequence than you might imagine. What matters is that the truth has been established, however belatedly." Nevertheless, the formal proceedings went forward, and in due course the conviction was overturned. The court found that the false testimony had been material to the verdict, and that Aldridge had been denied a fair trial through the deceptions practised by those who should have been guardians of justice. The finding stopped short of declaring him innocent of the underlying fraud, for the evidence on that charge remained substantial, but it acknowledged that the manslaughter conviction had been a miscarriage of justice. Throughout this period I observed Holmes with interest, noting the absence of that satisfaction which usually attended the successful resolution of a case. He carried out his duties with his customary thoroughness, but derived no pleasure from the outcome. When I remarked upon this one evening as we sat in our familiar chairs, he was silent for some time before responding. "This case has reminded me, Watson, of the profound inadequacy of justice as a mechanism for addressing human complexity. We uncovered the truth, yes, and those responsible for Pembroke's death have been held accountable according to law. But what has truly been achieved? An old man will die in prison, having sacrificed the last years of his life to punishment for a moment's terrible misjudgment. A woman who acted from misguided conviction has been branded a perjurer and will live the remainder of her days under the shadow of public disgrace. And Pembroke himself remains dead, his meticulous devotion to truth having led him to a lonely end in a darkened archive." He drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward in the lamplight. "I cannot help but reflect that if Pembroke had shown more flexibility, if Sir Edmund had possessed greater humility, if Mrs. Ashford had chosen honesty over expedience 20 years ago, all of this suffering might have been avoided. Yet each acted according to their nature and their understanding, and the result was tragedy. There is a lesson in that, I think, though I'm not certain what that lesson is. Perhaps, I suggested, the lesson is that we must be guided by principle, even when it leads to difficult outcomes. Pembroke's insistence on truth may have cost him his life, but surely he was right to value honesty over convenience. Was he, I wonder? Truth for its own sake, without consideration of consequences or compassion, can be as destructive as the lies it seeks to expose. Pembroke saw the world in absolutes, and absolutes are ill-suited to the messy reality of human existence. A little mercy, a little willingness to acknowledge the complexity of past actions, might have served everyone better than his rigid adherence to principle. I was surprised by this observation, for Holmes himself had often struck me as unbending in his pursuit of truth. He seemed to sense my thought, for he smiled slightly. "You think me hypocritical, Watson, and perhaps you're right. But this case has troubled me more than most. There are no villains here, merely flawed individuals who made poor choices and compounded them with further errors. The machinery of justice has ground them all to pieces, and while I cannot argue that the process was unjust, I cannot celebrate it either." We sat in contemplative silence for a time, each occupied with our own thoughts. At length, Holmes stirred and reached for a folder which lay upon the side table. "I received a letter today from Mr. Thornhill, the solicitor who first brought this matter to our attention. He writes to express his gratitude for our investigation, and to inform me that he has established a small trust in Pembroke's name to provide support for the maintenance of legal archives and the training of records clerks. He feels, he says, that some good should come from this tragedy, and that preserving Pembroke's dedication to accuracy and truth is the most fitting memorial." "A worthy gesture," I observed. "Indeed. It reminds us that even from sorrow and error, something of value may emerge. Pembroke's death has led to the exposure of a long-concealed injustice, and to the correction of a wrongful conviction. His insistence on truth, however inflexible it may have been, ultimately served a purpose which transcended his individual fate." Holmes set aside the letter and rose to stand before the window, looking out into the evening darkness. "Memory is a curious thing, Watson. We preserve it in records and archives, in testimony and documentation, believing that we are capturing truth for posterity. But memory is selective and malleable, shaped by our desires and our fears. The witness record in this case was substituted not once but twice. First when Mrs. Ashford assumed a false identity, and again when she attempted to erase evidence of Pembroke's discovery. Each substitution was motivated by what seemed, at the time, to be reasonable considerations, yet each led inevitably to further deception and greater harm." He turned back to face me. "The weight of memory is not merely in what we remember, but in how we choose to preserve or alter it. Every document in those carefully maintained archives represents choices made about what to record and what to omit, what to emphasize and what to minimize. We tell ourselves that we are preserving objective truth, but there is no such thing as objectivity in human affairs. There is only perspective, bias, and the hope that through careful attention to detail we may approximate something resembling accuracy. And yet, I said, surely the effort is worthwhile. Without some attempt to preserve truth, we're left with nothing but competing fabrications and deliberate distortions." "Yes," Holmes agreed, "the effort is worthwhile, even when it fails, even when it leads to tragedy. Pembroke understood that, I think. He knew that his insistence on truth might cost him dearly, but he could not in good conscience do otherwise. There is a courage in that which deserves recognition, even as we lament the consequences it produced." The case of the substituted witness record was thus concluded, leaving in its wake a trail of damaged lives and hard-earned wisdom. I have recorded it here as faithfully as my recollection permits, mindful of Holmes's observations regarding the selectivity of memory and the impossibility of perfect objectivity. If I have emphasized certain elements over others, if I have shaped the narrative to serve particular purposes, I can only plead that such is the nature of all human testimony, however well-intentioned. What remains clear, beyond the particulars of false testimony and tragic death, is the enduring truth that Holmes articulated that evening, that time does not erase wrongdoing but merely conceals it, waiting for the patient observer to bring it once more to light. Whether such revelation serves justice or merely satisfies curiosity, whether it heals wounds or opens new ones, these are questions which each case must answer for itself. In this instance, I am content to record that the truth was discovered, that those responsible were held accountable, and that from the shadows of deception, a measure of clarity was ultimately achieved. If that constitutes justice, then justice was served. If it falls short of that standard, then we must acknowledge the limitations of human institutions and human judgment, and resolve to do better when next such challenges present themselves. Sherlock Holmes would ask for no more than that, and I can offer no less.